The first one of those Chinese gifts was a new loom, and it immediately caused a problem. It speeded up weaving because the thread lifting business was now done by foot pedals, not by the weaver's hands anymore. The new loom produced cloth so fast, they ran into the problem of not enough yarn. See, up to then, you spun yarn in a way that hadn't changed for centuries. You teased the fibres out of the mass and hand-twisted them onto a spindle. It took hours. Then, in the 13th century, the second Chinese idea arrived and solved the problem because it produced yarn fast enough to keep up with the new loom. It was the spinning wheel. Early on, they didn't have much more than the wheel and the spindle. Foot pedals came later. But these two simple bits of machinery fitted together like bits of a jigsaw. And when they did, the places they were used got very, very rich. Places like Bruges. Bruges was one of the richest of the medieval cities built by the woolen trade, and if you know anybody called Draper, boy, were his ancestors well off. The cloth merchants made so much loot, they didn't know what to do with it. They built roads, canals, guild halls, cathedrals. They even had their own laws. And in spite of all that, they still had enough money left for high-technology music. Not just this kind of toy, the kind you can still hear in the cathedral towers all over Belgium, where the carillon still plays. Recognize the mechanism? It's the cam again, tripping levers that pulled wires that eventually pulled the clapper on one or other of a number of differently tuned bells. You set the cams in like pegs to trip certain levers and ring certain bells. Now, the reason all the good burghers had all these extra goodies was because they'd found a new market for their wool. See, all over Europe, people now had surplus, and surplus always looks for a ready market. South from Scandinavia and England and Flanders came fur and wool and cloth. North, through the Mediterranean, through Genoa and Venice, came silk and spices from the Far East. East, from France and Spain, came salt, wine and Cordovan leather. And from Russia, fur, I suppose. Everybody's crossroads lay in the county of Champagne at 4 little towns where they set up the first international markets, called the Champagne Fairs. The biggest fair was held at Troyes, in those days half the size of London. And merchants turned up because they got a special safe conduct from the king and armed guards along the road. Of course, the town made a bit out of it too. You had to pay a license to set up your stall, and there was a sales tax. Isn't there always? And you had to pay to come in and out of town. Not that any of this bothered the merchants. They just upped the price. Funny how some things don't change. Anyway, this international money-making went like a house on fire, especially among those able to turn up with the very, very rare stuff, like silk, where you really made a packet. Most of the really fancy stuff was brought by the Italians, who practically ran the place. By 1275, there were no less than 15 Italian cities who had consulates here in Troyes. The reason the Italians mattered so much was because when everybody got back from a crusade in the Middle East to their rather dull northern European town, all they could talk about were the amazing luxuries of the mysterious Orient. Silk, cinnamon, pepper, elephant tusks. Things which the Italians were very well placed to provide at the fairs. The Venetians, the Genoese, and the Pisans all had trading colonies all around the eastern Mediterranean, where they could pick up stuff from as far away as China. Well, there was so much money to be made here. And given the fact that the Genoese have always had a reputation for being where the profits are, It's not surprising that it was probably they who came up with a way to keep the financial ball rolling, so to speak, with this thing. It's an investment contract called a commenda. Now, this is a copy, but this particular one was written on the 14th of November, 1244, and it's a contract between a travelling merchant called John of the parish of St. Genesius and a draper called Otto, there's Otto, who is investing 81 Genoese pounds as a share in a load of purple cloth and gold silk that John the merchant is bringing up here to the Champagne fairs. The agreement goes on to say that John can use his discretion as to where and when he trades, on condition that when he gets back to Genoa, Otto gets detailed accounts and his share of the profits. This tatty bit of paper, which looks like an everyday affair thing you write in the back of an envelope practically, represents a really fundamental innovation, because it brought everybody, rich and poor, who had any spare cash in on the act. And that spread the risk, and that encouraged more merchants to go to more places. So the Champagne fairs and others, places like this, really boomed. It looked as if good times were here to stay. And then, at the beginning of the 14th century, came a change in the weather. Freezing winters and rainy summers. Bad harvests followed, and then famine. With little or no surplus crops to sell, money became tight, and the fairs began to fail. All over Europe, people tightened their belts. And in this weakened condition, they were virtually defenseless against attack. And when it came, in 1347, the effect was devastating. All the more so because they had no defense against the enemy. It was a flea. The flea carried the Black Death, and from when it arrived in Europe in 1347 on board ship from the Crimea to when it receded only 4 years later, it killed maybe 40 million people. 200,000 villages were totally wiped out. At the height of the plague, there weren't enough living to bury the dead. The flea sucked the disease in rat's blood, and when the rat died, it jumped onto people and bit them. The effect was appalling, from fever to abscesses in the groin and armpits to death inside 24 hours. Black pustules spread all over the body, which was why they called it the Black Death. The effects were particularly bad in the towns, packed with people busy making all that money. The plague ripped through them. And a new face appeared in all the pictures. And for those with itchy feet, a new kind of dance you could unexpectedly find yourself swinging to. The dance of death. One grimly enjoyable thing came out of it all. The people who died left their money to the people who lived. All they could hope for was that they'd survive to enjoy it. Well, no nightmare lasts forever. By 1351, the worst was over. When it was all over, the survivors went insane, trying to forget the horror they'd lived through. Life everywhere in Europe became one long hysterical shindig. People spent the money the plague had given them on the wildest outfit they could buy. If you were rich, silk embroidered with gold wire was the thing. The middle classes went into expensive little numbers in wool and velvet. And the peasants? Well, thanks to that loom way back and the fact that flax is cheap to grow, linen was their thing. Well, it was everybody's thing, really, in hats and shirts and bed sheets. And especially if you take an indiscreet look up the nearest girl's skirt. That. Underwear. And just this once, that's the great historical trigger of change. What you're looking at now. Yes, frilly knickers. This is the first result of the great 14th century bed linen and underwear boom. The guy who used to go around collecting bones for fertilizer now started collecting linen too. He became a rag and bone man. Why? Well, that's the second result of everybody wearing linen, because when they wore it out, they threw it away. So there was this great pile of linen rag. And guess who went bananas about that? Okay, let me give you a clue. The first thing that happens to the linen in this process is that they take it and rip it against a knife to make the rags even smaller. And what is shredded linen rag absolutely perfect for making? Yes, paper. So the paper makers got an unexpected linen rag bonanza, pounded by hammers, tripped again by the can. You bash the rag in water and gum for 48 hours, and the sludge you get is paper pulp. Slosh that onto a wire mesh frame, count 5, and you've got yourself a sheet of paper. Well, a sheet of very wet paper. So the next thing you do, no prizes, is dry it. Funny coincidence, the wire mesh frame. A lot of wire makers about, making all that gold embroidery people had started wearing. Anyway, the paper. You lay each sheet between layers of woolen cloth to soak up the moisture. Looks more like a sheet of porridge, doesn't it? And when you've got a big pile of wool and wet paper sandwiches stacked up, you call the lads. All you do now is squeeze the pile in a press until you've got nearly all the water out of the paper when you hang it up to dry, and that's all there is to it. Funny how it all comes together here in the paper mill. The water power to run the cams, tripping the hammers to make the pulp, the wine press come linen press to squeeze out the water, and thanks to the automatic loom, the linen that makes the pulp. And because of all that free linen, suddenly the cheapest thing around was paper.